Good morning, everyone. I'm Jan Coe, Provost to the Cathedral, and wanted to add my warm welcome to the Cathedral and thank yous for being here. You can see with the 1-hour breakfast, we've given you ample time to consume it and have conversation, but we're committed to keeping this to an hour, so we will move things along. Diane Rehm is beloved. She is no stranger to this cathedral. And I have to say, speaking personally, that I have never seen you more radiant, Diane, than when you and John walked down the aisle after your beautiful wedding in this place. It was something. And this cathedral then is like the cathedral today, filled with joy and love and hope and promise. That's part of why we're here. And as you heard in the theme for our breakfast, it's listening and leading. And one of the hallmarks of your extraordinary career was the way in which you actively listened, respectfully listened, and taught us what that looks like and modeled that for us. In these days, don't we all seek listening and civil conversation and respect? That's part of what we're here for this morning, and part of what will be highlighted in the video that you are about to see. Ways in which this living cathedral seeks to listen, to convene, to lead, to touch, to transform, so that when we leave this place, we're different than when we entered it. And so thank you for being here. God bless you. And let's watch the video that our wonderful communications team has put together for us.
Now, some buildings we pass through, but some buildings are our teachers. And to hang around this building is to be taught. We build our buildings, and then they build us. A building like this calls forth awe, and I don't think there's faith that is possible without awe. A building like this calls forth reverence, and reverence is the mother of moral life. We see beauty and we follow beauty to God.
One of the greatest joys I have on Sunday mornings is the receiving line and the responses that I hear from the visitors who come to the cathedral. They are so astounded and taken aback by the beauty of this place. They can feel the Holy Spirit in this place. And when they feel that Spirit, they want to go deeper. This cathedral is big enough and broad enough and deep enough that each one of us can find our place here and be transformed by the experience we have in this place.
When persons come into the cathedral, what I hope that they will hear is what we're engaged in today. It is not just an opportunity to see where we've been, but coming to the cathedral is an opportunity to really take note of where we're going.
When we talk about race, or about gun violence prevention, or about veterans in the military and how we re-engage folks after they come back, this is a space that informs how we have those conversations, and we listen to each other differently in the sacred space, and we hear each other in ways that aren't possible in other places. So you leave changed, right? You leave after having had a conversation that changes your heart because we listen to each other.
The wonderful thing about convening in this space is the fact that it is this space. This house of prayer for all people, this sacred structure where everything points to God and God's goodness and God's presence among us as human beings, has an effect on people. And what we're looking for is not just wonderful conversations, but what we're always striving for is making opportunities where we can listen to one another, where we can more deeply interact with one another, where the Spirit can be present in our conversations so that we hear in new ways.
In order to be part of a choir, it's not a solo. It's not a one-person show. You know, you have to be in tune with the people around you, with the sound as a whole. We learn so many skills in choir that we can carry with us through life, in our school environment, in the world. You know, it's not about us necessarily. We are contributing to something greater, and I think that that's really, really powerful of the cathedral, that it has that ability to draw us all together, to be able to listen to one another. And the fact that it's so expansive, it carries our voices further than anywhere else can.
The thing about this cathedral is its power to bring people together and send them out into the world being better people. That is the gospel walk, to bring people together, to heal them, and then to send them out into the world to do good.
What's most important is that this cathedral must be so much more than just a beautiful building or a wonderful place to visit. It has to be a place where everything that we do in our worship and in our music and in our programming points to God, points to the holy, points to us being better than we know we can be.
The building holds on to everything that happens here. So whether that is a concert or a worship service that we do often, or a group of people doing yoga filling the nave, or a drum circle where people are drumming out their spirit, or veterans who are coming here for a pilgrimage to experience God in their lives in a new way. All of those things happen here, and when you come in the building later, you feel them. You know that extraordinary things have happened in this place, and they're still here.
When you come into this cathedral, it's impossible not to experience the living stones, the living history that's being made each and every day in this place. And when we enter this space, and if we can listen, you can't miss experiencing God. And it is in that transformative experience of God that we take that with us from this place, carrying that light into the world.
Great, Diane, thank you so much for being with us today. It is a real treat to have you here. I have been a big fan of yours for many, 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 many years. And my first question for you is really, given the current sort of environment in which we live and the bifurcations that we see across our culture, what are you hearing and picking up out there as you continue to do your work?
For me, being here is such an inspiration. It reminds me always of how important it is to be peaceful, to be quiet, which is hard to do of late because we just got now a 10-week-old puppy who kept us up all night long. But that's all right. Being here is inspirational. But how do I function? How do I perceive what is happening in this world? I think that Roseanne is a perfect example of what's happening in this world. The need to create what in Arabic we call aj'a, which is confusion, a mess, a creation of conflict. And then something else happens. And there is a reaction to that. In my case, what I am trying to do now in the podcast and through a documentary on which I am working. I was out in California all last week filming a documentary on the right to die, which after my podcast But first I'll put my husband, my little dog. I find peace and quiet as soon as I walk into our home, and try to find equilibrium there in the face. I've never in my life, and I was on the air about 40 years, hosting the show for 37. I have never, in all these presidents we've seen come and go, seen such terrible turmoil.
You know, in those 37 years of hosting your show, you sat with thousands of people.
Yes.
And I was always amazed at your ability to sit in the middle of conversations that were sometimes they were two-sided, sometimes they were three-sided, and to sort of work that conversation. Share with us some of your secrets of what it means to be a good listener. How does one do that as an honest broker for all those years? Were there certain things that you always paid attention to, or certain guidelines that you always tried to follow, because you were an honest broker and continue to be an honest broker for so many people, for so many different kinds of conversations?
You know, listening for me doesn't happen just through the ears. Listening happens when you watch body language, when you look in the eyes of someone, when you truly, truly open your heart and hear with every ounce of your being. I remember striving so hard when Donald Trump came into office, hearing those people who support Donald Trump and trying to understand to the best of my ability what it is that was lacking in our politics that they felt Donald Trump represented. It's hard. It's hard for me. I am a lifelong Democrat. I continue to speak out on issues that I care about, but I know I must be educated by listening to those who feel otherwise. And I strive as hard as I can to watch Fox News, to watch MSNBC, to watch CNN, but most of all, frankly, to listen to National Public Radio. Because there I do get worthwhile news.
I think it was Henry Nouwen who once said that listening is a kind of spiritual hospitality. And I think that's a great line. You know, he said that, you know, when we listen, we open up ourselves to the possibility of being changed.
I love his writings.
You know, when we argue, we're trying to win our point. If we're really listening to someone, we are being vulnerable to that person. And one of the things I feel that's lacking in many places in our, at least the sort of public culture we see on television, is a lack of deep listening to one another. That concerns me, that we're all trying to make our next point. You know, we're all trying to get across what we think or to correct someone else, as opposed to listening to their story, listening to where they're coming from. And I think that's so deeply important. I was watching I don't know how many of you all may have seen the documentary about John McCain that was on HBO. I guess it was Sunday night it came out. And what was fascinating to me, besides so many things about his wonderful life and the great things that he's done, was how many friendships he created across the aisle. and how deeply they knew and respected one another, even though they would vehemently disagree on points. It was the relationships, the knowing one another's stories that seemed to cross those boundaries.
You know, my producers have told me that John McCain was on my program 7 times. And one of the last times he was on was shortly after the United States went into Iraq, which I totally, vehemently disagreed with. So I challenged him, but I listened to him. And at the end of the program, he said to me, "Diane, I know you don't agree with my perspective, but thank you for listening." He's a great listener and a great sharer of ideas. He holds firm to those in which he believes, and clearly has been an outspoken critic of this president, who, I must say, insulted John McCain in such a way that broke my heart.
The spirit of meanness sometimes that exists in our culture these days is very troubling to me, and sometimes it comes from all angles and all different directions.
But how about you? How do you experience that meanness?
Here we go.
That sense of conflict, even within this glorious cathedral.
Well, it's interesting. You know, here we try to be a place, a house of prayer for all people. And so we see folks coming. There were folks here after the election. We held a number of services and had the cathedral open after the election. And there were those folks who were quite overjoyed about the election and the new President Trump. And there were many people in tears here walking through the cathedral and quite in a panic about the fact that Trump had been elected. And what I thought was really important for us is that we be here and be available to people who both were celebrating what our nation was doing and those who were mourning what our nation was doing. What was so noticeable to me was that how visceral it was.
Exactly.
On both sides.
Exactly.
And I worry that we are beginning to limit people to their political identities, as opposed to seeing beyond those identities. I mean, one of the things I love about, not to get preachy here, but one of the things I love about Jesus is that his disciples came from this vast spectrum of culture. He had as his closest disciples people that others would think should not have been his disciples. He had women as some of his closest friends. He had zealots and tax collectors and very simple fishermen. You know, that he was seeing beyond the labels that people were putting on one another. And I think there's a real calling in our culture today that we have to see beyond the labels that we're posting on one another if we're going to move forward in this country. And that's what I want this cathedral to be, is sort of is very much in the similar sorts of way that you have done in your program, for this cathedral to be an honest broker for conversations where there aren't winners and losers, but where we see perhaps more deeply where one another is coming from on various positions.
I have the feeling that the women's movement, the Me Too movement, has created openings not yet fully realized, and that women who are on the ballots in record numbers around the country this year will indeed find a way to make a difference in that kind of listening. Frankly, and I say this with all humility, I think women grew up learning to listen more than to speak. and that there is a learning process going on among all of us, learning to open our ears, our minds, and our hearts, and we shall see if women are elected in large numbers to the Congress this year, what a difference that could make. I have my fingers crossed.
Tell us a little bit about you. If I'm correct, your family comes from Turkey. You're of Turkish descent, and did you grow up in an Orthodox household, Christian Orthodox household?
Yes, I was baptized in the Syrian Orthodox Church, which I found out later the Episcopal Church recognizes and accepts both the baptism, and I was confirmed here in the Cathedral as an Episcopalian. I grew up in a fairly strict Syrian home. I was not allowed to ask questions.
You've been making up for it.
Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. What was pronounced was the law. And there was no dating until I was 16. And even then, my father stood at the door and interrogated every young man who came to the house. Perhaps many of you of my generation had that same experience, but my mother died at 49. My father died 11 months later of a broken heart. I met John Ream at the Department of State. I was his secretary. He was an attorney. We were married for 54 years until he died of Parkinson's, having to starve himself, having to refuse all food, all medication, and water. And it took 10 days for him to die, which is why I feel so very strongly about an individual's right to choose death at a time when there is no hope. John Ream could no longer feed himself. He could no longer stand on his own. He could no longer do anything for himself. And he said, I refuse to fall into further indignation.
Having been through all the things that you have been through, has your work always been a sustaining part of your life? Has it been something that's fed you all these years?
But you know, I was a homemaker for 14 years. I did not go to college. I came out of high school, went to work as a secretary, and work did not come to me until I was 37 years old. I stayed at home with those children and then began to volunteer at this tiny little radio station, WAMU, which then was not even part of NPR because it had only 2 employees full-time, and you had to have 5 employees to be part of NPR. The first fundraiser I ever did, we raised a massive total of $3,000 in a week. And our most recent fundraiser brought in 1.4 million. So you can see how we've had this tremendous growth. And I've been lucky enough to be part of it because I got in 1973 as a volunteer and worked my way up. 1979, I became host of the show, and it grew to 2.8 million listeners daily. I was very fortunate.
You know, when we think about listening, and sometimes when we really listen to someone, we're changed, and that's the wonderful thing about it. Can you think of an occasion in your, I'm sure there are many of them, but does one stand out for you where you were in a conversation with someone on your show and you came into the conversation with one opinion and you ended that conversation with a totally different opinion, where you were changed by someone's presence?
I think music affects me in such an extreme way. And there were times when one of my producers would say, "Oh, you have to have this musical group on." And I'd say, "Who are they?" And of course, the young people on my staff knew exactly who they were, and I had no idea. So opening one's heart to those different approaches to life have really helped me, have helped me to see the world in a broader way than I think. This whole experience of hosting this show has been absolutely remarkable for me. It was John Ream who helped me to grow, to understand. My world was very small compared to his. He had been educated at Harvard and Columbia and knew the world as I did not. He was my greatest teacher. And I say that in memory of a marriage that lasted so long, and yet, like many here, was not without its difficulties. So I say to you that John was my greatest teacher and an extraordinary love. And I left that marriage after he died feeling as though I will never again be married. I will never again do anything but be on my own. And that was the title of my last book. And then what happens but John Hagedorn comes into my life.
Well, you know the old saying, if you want to make God laugh, just tell him your plans.
Now, I have a question for you because you have heard many, many sermons from the pulpit. Have there been one or two that have dramatically changed your thinking?
You know, that's a really interesting question. There have been preachers in my life. I think about Frederick Buechner in particular. I'm a big fan of Frederick Buechner, and both hearing him preach and having a chance to study with him and reading his works were dramatically life-changing for me as a young priest and even in college before going into the ministry. So
life-changing how?
Well, it was the way, if you've never read any Buechner, Buechner had a way of saying things that were eternally true and deeply powerful, deeply meaningful and powerful, but he had a way of saying them in not a simple way, but in a way that really resonated for his time period. I think that's the great challenge of all religion, whether it's Judaism or Islam or Christianity. It's sharing that faith, sharing the truth of that religion for each generation in a way that generation can hear it. And Buechner was one of those people for me, growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was very present.
I think Maya Angelou did the same for me, helping me understand a life I could not possibly have imagined. And yet she came through with such strength and such glory. And what a life she lived.
Incredible.
The last conversation I had with her, I said, "Thank you, Dr. Angelou, for being with me." And she said, "Wait a minute, I want to say something." She said, "If you and I lived in the same town, I think we would be great friends. We'd sit, we'd have a glass of wine together, we would talk about what's happening in the world." Those were the last words she ever said to me, and I remember them.
What a gift that must have been.
What a gift.
And when you talk about preachers today, I got to put a plug in. Bishop Michael Curry, God bless him, is really bringing the heat,
Yes. He was really something. I could watch.
Although everybody thinks he's a Baptist from Chicago,
I know. I saw it, and I saw the faces of the clergy at that wedding, and I thought they are taken almost out of their seats by what he said. He was wonderful.
He was wonderful, and I never thought I would see an Episcopal priest, much less a bishop, on Saturday Night Live in a skit, and that was...
How about that?
That was great. I was going to post it, and then I figured right after I saw it, I was going to post it on Facebook, and I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. And like half an hour later, he'd posted it, so I just love that.
Smart man.
Smart man, yeah.
Smart man.
Absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough for giving us your time this morning. I would like to sit here and just talk with you about, some of your favorite folks that you have sat with.
Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers, I know. And he was always been someone I've loved ever since childhood.
Absolutely.
And one of the most theological men in a very simple way. What a great gift he was to this country.
Do you know that when I had him on, he was in Pittsburgh playing the piano and in his studio, and at one point I said to him, "Mr. Rogers, do you ever get sad?" And he said, "Well, yes, I do." And he said, "As a matter of fact, I'm sad today." And I said, "Well, why are you sad?" And he said, "Because my stomach hurts." He was dead 3 months later of stomach cancer, and I, to this day, do not think he knew when he said that, because I don't think he would have said it if he had known. I've met his wife. I've dared not to ask her, but he was one of the best human beings I've ever had the pleasure of speaking with.
Amen to that.
Thank you.
And thank you, as Mr. Rogers left an amazing legacy in this country, and thank you for the legacy that you're leaving and still creating for us in this country, and for your work and for being with us. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.